Ian Rowe is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education and upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. Mr. Rowe is also co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools in the Bronx, with the first one that just opened in 2022. He's also the chairman of the board of Spence Chapin, a nonprofit adoption services organization, and the co-founder of the National Summer School Initiative. He concurrently serves as a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center and a writer for the 1776 Unites campaign. We'll have about 10 minutes for your own questions after Ian's presentation. So please have your questions ready, and then I'll relay your questions to Ian Rowe. And Ian, I just wanted to mention that I read a lot about your new charter school initiative and all the great things that you're doing. And so thank you for all those good things. I'm super inspired. I know everyone else is going to be as well, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. And so without any further delay, let's all welcome Ian Rowe.
Hello, hello. John, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I get exhausted just kind of listening to it. I'm very excited to speak with you today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Hopefully there'll be a future opportunity to do so. But I'm excited to have a conversation with you about this concept of agency and why I think we're at a moment in our country where this concept is so important, particularly to the idea of human flourishing, because there are competing ideas, like a focus on equity that we'll soon talk about, that I think is having a very depressing impact on how young people in particular think about what they have the ability to achieve in American society. As John said, I just launched a new network of international baccalaureate high schools in the Bronx. In addition to that, for the last decade, I ran a network of elementary and middle public charter schools, also in the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And this is a community when I was running our elementary and middle schools. This is a district in New York City, District 7, where only 2% of kids that start 9th grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college, meaning that they started 9th grade, but they dropped out somewhere along the way, or they did earn their high school diploma, but still could not do math nor reading without remediation if they were to actually go to college. So, what is worse? You actually drop out, or you do what you're actually supposed to do, and still you're not able to function or compete on an equal playing field. It's those kind of conditions that create the kind of demand that we saw for our schools and other high-performing schools in the Bronx and other areas across the country. Each year we had maybe 200 or so open seats that we were accepting in our lottery process, but we had nearly 5,000 families on the wait list. And lottery day is one of the most excruciating, bittersweet days, because we can call 100 to 200 families to say, you got the golden ticket. Your child got a seat in the lottery, and it's random. There's no academic screening. It's simply luck of the draw. But it's the most excruciating thing to have to send a note to nearly 5,000 families to say that the best we can do is to put your child on an excruciatingly long wait list. And these are families, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic families, who all they want is an equal shot. They don't want their kid to be viewed as a victim or someone who has to have the government ensure their success. They just want to be able to compete on a level playing field. And that's why I do the work that I do, because I run schools and I write books and I hold my research at AEI. I want kids, I want individuals in the rising generation to know that they can do hard things. that there will be barriers. There will be a host of challenges, because guess what? Life is not fair for anyone of any race. I mean, one of the fascinating things about human beings is that we are all individuals with unique challenges, unique strengths, every single one of us. And we cannot succumb to the temptation of assuming that because you're of a certain color or of a certain gender or a certain economic class, that you either have inherent advantages or disadvantages. And we need a school system, and we need an ethos and a culture that recognizes this individual dignity, our common humanity, the idea of equality of opportunity. And I have sensed, certainly over the last few years, an acceleration of ideas which are in conflict with the concepts of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and our common humanity. And so what I'd like to speak about for a few minutes is these two meta-narratives that I've certainly seen emerge quite dramatically over the last, particularly over, well, certainly for a longer period of time, but accelerated since the death of George Floyd, where there's been a national reckoning around race, around transgender issues, and we as a country have become even more polarized, particularly around this sense of identity group identification and sort of an ethos that follows from sort of breaking up our common humanity into these individualized factions that some have characteristics of oppressor, some have characteristics of oppressed, and we're forgetting the individuals that lie at the heart of our nation. The two meta-narratives that I often reflect on are, one I call blame the system, and the other is blame the victim. And these two meta-narratives are usually offered up as the explanation as to why we have such deep division in our country, or why there's certain segments of our society that seem to be entrenched in a cycle of disadvantage or poverty or dysfunction or broken families. And when these two meta-narratives dominate the airwaves, it kind of sucks the air out of any other kind of diagnosis, or more importantly, any other kind of prescriptions or solutions that could be far more productive to the idea of human flourishing. So the blame the system narrative, that is a view of the United States that if you're not successful, it's because America itself is an oppressive nation, that there are systems that are rigged against you, particularly if you're of a certain race, of a certain gender, of a certain economic class, that these systems, there's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. Capitalism itself is evil, and that these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, so powerful that you as an individual are powerless to overcome them. And we can talk through several examples of what I'm talking about, but just really quickly, if you look at any, for example, conversations around the racial wealth gap, again, we'll talk a little bit more about this. For some people, the very fact that if you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, for example, the average white family has about $160,000 more wealth than the average Black family. And that's it. Mic drop. That's the proof of systemic, both historic and present day discrimination. And if you feel that the only reason for that wealth gap is because of systemic racism, then your solution set is very narrow. And in many cases, you'll hear ideas for reparations. And for example, in California right now, they're considering plans for the government to just give Black people, certain Black people, $5 million to make up for years of, and again, present day and historic discrimination in their rationale. Now, mind you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the racial wealth gap, when you take into account just two factors, family structure and education level, the gap completely reverses. The average Black married, college-educated family has about $160,000 more wealth than the average white single-parent family. Wow. So perhaps there are factors outside of just race that can have a huge impact on the level of success in human flourishing. But if you have the blame the system ideology, those are details you just completely ignore, and you continue to focus on the systemic factors that you feel are at the core of any kind of disparity. So in a blame the system kind of ideology, you are rendered helpless as an individual, and you have to wait on some massive government or other kind of intervention or distribution, but it's not on you. In the blame the victim narrative, which is actually at the complete opposite of the spectrum, in that narrative, if you are not successful, it's not because America is the problem. America is great. America is the land of opportunity. The streets are paved with gold. And if you're not successful, you're the problem, not America. You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You didn't take advantage of all these opportunities that have been laid out for you in this great country. And it is a great country, but this ideology says, why didn't you make it? Look, there are all these other examples of people that have made it. Why haven't you? The challenge with the blame the victim narrative is that it ignores the reality of what happens, for example, in kids that grow up, for example, in the communities where I lead schools. What if you're born into a family, into a low-income single-parent household? What if you're born into a community or into a household that doesn't value religious faith? What if you're born into a community that you don't have access to educational freedom, and the only schools you have access to are those where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college? And let me say another thing here in New York City, because this also is mirrored across the country. In that same district where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, there's a cap on charter schools. So meaning that there's a legislative barrier to creating more schools. So if you had an innovative idea to launch a great school to serve those 5,000 families on our wait list alone, not to mention the tens of thousands of other families cumulatively that are on other charter school wait lists, if you had an idea, you couldn't do it. There literally is and that is an example of a systemic barrier impeding the ability to create schools that would certainly assist in the goal of human flourishing. A 7-year-old can't solve that problem, right? So it's really hard to blame that kid for those conditions that make it much harder. And we can have that conversation while simultaneously demanding personal responsibility from that 7-year-old as they grow up to make the right kinds of decisions to be successful. But the point is, this blame the system and blame the victim ideology add up to a singular lie, which robs young people of the very agency, the very idea that they can lead a self-determined life. And something about a lot of my work is always, what is the empowering alternative that I am putting forth? So I'm not just shouting in the rain. So often I feel in these very polarized times that we're certainly spending a lot of time arguing, but we're not spending a lot of time solving. And so I really started to think about my own experience running schools for the last now close to 15 years in communities like the Bronx and Lower East Side, and also, my time prior to running schools. I was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we gave away close to $500 million in 1 year on the post-secondary team, trying to find new answers to how to increase the number of low-income young adults that were finishing college. So not just finishing high school or starting college, but actually completing. And what we found was that many of the issues that these young people were facing in the college challenge was because they were entering high school, or entering college, not academically prepared, not financially prepared, not culturally prepared, not socially prepared for the kinds of demands that come to you once you're entering young adulthood and entering college and entering the workplace. I had spent time at Teach for America in the early days. I'd run my own internet business. I worked at the White House during the time that No Child Left Behind was conceived. And so over that time, I just observed a lot of young people from every conceivable background, kids from low-income backgrounds, upper-income backgrounds, white kids, Black kids, Asian kids, poor kids, rich kids, kids in homeless shelters, every kind of kid. I worked at MTV for 6 years and helped distribute films like Waiting for Superman. And so I had a lot of different perspectives on what was going on in education. And I've come to the conclusion that we need a third way, a way that counters the blame the victim and the blame the system narratives. And I call this empowering alternative agency. Because my observation for those kids, and I've seen kids who've been grown up in very challenging conditions, and as they've made their passage into young adulthood, the kinds of decisions they've made have actually reinforced the narrative and actually perpetuated the cycle of disadvantage. And yet, I've seen other kids in those same exact challenging situations develop different mindsets and develop different rationale for the kinds of decisions they've made. And as they entered young adulthood, they have broken the cycle. They have broken this pattern of disadvantage. And one of the things that's so amazing to me about social science in general is that we obsess over failure. I mean, you will see lots and lots and lots and lots of poverty studies and domestic violence. You'll see tons of research, but there isn't as much about research about what are the factors that are common about people that are successful over the long run. Is there anything that's common about that? Is it just random? Are they all just, LeBron James or sports athletes who just suddenly emerge? Or are there actually factors and institutions that matter, that are crucial to human flourishing? And so what I have observed, certainly over my last 20, 30 years working with young people, is that those young people who've made a change in their life, a change in their pattern, have what I describe a sense of personal agency. And usually that there have been 4 institutions or 4 pillars that have helped influence that series of decisions. And I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So think of agency like a vector or velocity. Each one of us has the ability to make independent decisions, right? Our free will. But how do we exercise that free will? How do we make decisions so that it's in line with the idea of human flourishing and not personal destruction? So think of agency like a vector or velocity, where velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So if we all have this capacity for agency and free will, where do we learn how to become a morally discerning person? And that's where these 4 pillars come into place. In my observations over time, looking at those kids who made different series of decisions, the first of the 4 pillars is centered around family. The key in this particular first decision, it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. For so many kids who are from backgrounds in which they faced dysfunctional households, and it could be a single parent family, or it could be a married 2-parent house. There's no guarantee, but regardless of the challenges they may have faced in their own life, as they made their passage into young adulthood, typically The decisions they made were much more about delaying having children, or if they did have children, it was always in marriage first. There's data that, again, we'll talk about a little bit more, called the success sequence. Some of you may be familiar with this data that it essentially says, if you finish just your high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And if you have children, marriage first. 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. And this data has been replicated in other countries, in certainly other studies within the United States. The Brookings Institution was one of the first institutions to identify this data. It's been replicated by the American Enterprise Institute. It's almost common sense, right? Education, work, marriage, children. Those are kind of the building blocks. And probably for many of you, you're hearing a name put on, the success sequence, a name being put onto something that was just organic for your family. Well, the reality is, for many, many, many young people of all races growing up in different communities, that is not the norm. The non-marital birth rate in the community that I lead schools is 84%. 84%. Among women across the country, among women 24 and under who have children, the non-marital birth rate for women 24 and under who have children is 71% across the country. It's 91% in the Black community and 61% in the white community for women 24 and under who have children. And about 40% of those are to young women who are having at least their second child. So these are non-married women. And again, I will say it right from the outset, if you're born into a single parent home, that's not necessarily a guarantee that your life will be a disaster, nor is it a guarantee that if you're born into a married two-parent household, is your life, just magical and everything's great. But the data is overwhelming. If we're teaching young people about the likelihood of decisions that will lead to a life of flourishing, we have to be honest about what the data says so that they can make the best informed decisions for themselves. So in this first area of family, the decisions that I've seen young people make, they have not been constrained by the family that they're from. They've made decisions about the family they form, or the timing of the family they form, which is much more in line with this progression around the success sequence. And it's one of the reasons we actually teach this in our schools, and we'll talk to you about how we do that. So that's the first big pillar, that young people who seem to go on a different trajectory, to change, to break their cycle of disadvantage, they're not constrained by the family that they're from. They make better decisions about the family they form. The second big area that I've observed in seeing young people who make this better transition to young adulthood is that they've adopted a personal faith commitment in their own life. Doesn't matter if it's Christianity, Buddhism, Catholicism, doesn't matter. It's that they've chosen to live by a moral code, that there's actually right and wrong, that there are better ways of being a human being. Most importantly, that they're part of a community of people that they're seeing regularly, that they're part of rituals that, sometimes ritual takes on, I don't know, sometimes a dirty word, but good rituals are habit forming and healthy, particularly to the idea of human flourishing. Because when you have a personal faith commitment and you're part of a larger community that all lives by a moral code, it sets an expectation that you're more inclined to follow. And here again, the data is overwhelming. If you look at young people today, especially with the explosion in social media, like all these technologies that are supposed to make us all so connected, and yet this is one of the most disconnected generations. And if you look at levels of loneliness, alienation, depression, isolation, it's quite staggering, particularly what's happening amongst young people. And we know that religiosity overall as a country is declining. But when you compare the data for those young people who do have a personal faith commitment or are going to church on a regular basis, much lower levels much lower levels of depression, much lower levels of isolation, alienation. And again, these are young people who have the kind of commitment and part of a community that boosts them in the inevitable moments that life is hard. So that's the second area. So first, it's young people who are not constrained by the family that they're from. They made different decisions about the family that they formed. Two, they had some kind of personal faith commitment and a moral code by which they lived by. The third area that I've seen for why young people are able to break the cycle of disadvantage is that they had access to educational freedom or school choice or a charter school or an educational savings account. Something which empowered them and their parents to make a different decision that if they weren't satisfied with whatever school they were zoned for, they had the power to move with their feet, and what's ironic about the battle over things like school choice and educational freedom is that school choice and educational freedom already exist for millions and millions and millions of Americans all across the country, if you happen to be middle or upper class, because you already have the capacity to pay for a private school or move to a wonderful suburban neighborhood that might have incredible public schools. But if you live near 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx, or Division Street in Chicago, or parts of Houston, or parts of rural America, you don't have educational freedom. You don't have school choice. And so when young people are deprived of that reality, it's not surprising that you're not getting the best of what that young person can be. Imagine if you were growing up in a community where only 2% of kids graduated from high school ready for college. And when it was time for you to go to school, those were the choices you had. In fact, that was the only choice that you had. We're not going to achieve a culture of agency and human flourishing when those are the conditions. So that's the third area that I've seen for those young people who've been able to break the cycle of disadvantage. They had access to educational freedom of some kind of school choice. And what's interesting is that when those first three foundational elements are in place, that the family that you're forming, or the timing of the family you're forming, is on a path that will lead you much more to the direction of a success sequence, married, two-parent household. Even if you haven't gotten there yet, the decisions you're making about finishing your education, full-time work, are all in your future. That's the first element. You've had a personal faith commitment. You've benefited from having educational freedom and school choice. That usually creates the foundation for the last component, which I call entrepreneurship, and in this context, entrepreneurship is not only your ability to start a business, it's actually someone who's a problem solver in their own life, that you have an overcomer's mindset, that when inevitable challenge comes, you have the wherewithal, you're part of a community, you have the smarts, you've been prepared, you're more worldly, you're more knowledgeable, so you feel more confident in your ability to face those challenges and overcome those challenges. And so this entrepreneurial mindset, I think, is extremely, extremely important. And again, we'll talk about how we're choosing to cultivate it in our own schools. But that's the framework that I've observed in these four pillars, what I now call FREE: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. It's those four pillars that I am trying to put forth as my empowering alternative to the blame the system and the blame the victim ideologies, which in my view are robbing young people of the very idea of their own sense of self-determination. And in today's society, we see these arguments playing out, most notably in this category, what I call agency versus ideas of equity, where typically what equity means is the absence of disparities amongst particular identity groups. This is particularly prevalent in public education. So let's just give you one example. The racial achievement gap is a concept that has animated many education reformers for decades, 40, 50 years. If you look at the data from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, you will see there has been a racial achievement gap in reading for literally 40, 50 years. If this were a trend line, this may be white student performance, and this is Black student performance, right? And so that gap has basically stayed the same for decades. And for many, the racial achievement gap, that distance is caused by systemic discrimination, racial discrimination. Now, what's interesting, and so in order to achieve equity, we have to close that racial achievement gap. We have to eliminate the disparity between Black and white students, and that is the charge. Now, unfortunately, when you compare, white student performance and Black student performance, yes, there has been this gap for so long, but what's interesting is that in the entire history of the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is often called the nation's report card, there has never been a year in which more than something like 46, 47% of white students are reading at NAEP proficiency levels. Yes, in the entire history of NAEP, we've never had a year in which a majority of white students are reading at grade level based on the National Assessment for Educational Progress. So if we were to actually achieve equity in education by closing the racial achievement gap, what we will have achieved is universal mediocrity for everybody. That should not be our goal. But when we're locked into these narratives of the only identifier are these blunt categories of race, in this instance, then we tend to assume that if we're so obsessed with race as the driving factor for why there might be a disparity, then that tends to lead to, race-based diagnoses tend to lead to race-based solutions, which have not been effective for 40 and 50 years. So among the work I'm doing is now trying to work with the National Assessment for Educational Progress to start to look at other factors, most notably family structure. Because when you look at the outcomes for kids of any race who are being raised in married two-parent households, dramatically higher levels of reading performance, college completion relative to kids in all other family structures, whether it be single-parent households, guardian relationships, grandparents. We just have to be honest about these things. And yet, arguments like agency and equity stifle that conversation. And so I'm trying to do everything I can to broaden the conversation when we're looking at disparities in our country, the factors that really drive human flourishing, so that we can be honest. I mean, I will tell you, one more story. I mean, I've lots of stories which I'm always happy to share. When I took over running a network of elementary and middle schools, I said, starting in 2010, and our schools were doing quite well, and we had incredible demand, as I said, particularly in the South Bronx. We had nearly 5,000 families on the wait list. And so we decided to move our headquarters from Tribeca in Manhattan, where we're on West Broadway, very cool, and chic. You can get a latte on the corner. We moved to 149th Street in the South Bronx for our headquarters because we decided all of our growth of new schools was going to be in the South Bronx, and we should have our headquarters in the same community. And rather than a latte on the corner, there was a drug clinic on the corner, and so we had addicts, walking by. But you know what? This is where our kids are, because for every dysfunctional person we saw, there were lots of kids who were deserving of a great education. If we were going to open more great schools in the South Bronx, that's where our headquarters should be. And so we decided, because some of our staff was a little nervous and wanted to get a lay of the land. And so we decided to do a walking tour of the neighborhood. where's the local bank? Where's the local deli? Where's the local gym? Just so we can get our bearings on this new neighborhood that we are now going to be a part of, this new community that we wanted to become part of. So one day, and this was July 11th, 2016 at about 4 p.m. When you have these epiphany moments, you tend to remember exactly when it occurred, because when this occurred for me, everything changed. Everything that I had thought was necessary about running great schools, it became clear to me that that was insufficient, and I had to play a much larger role in talking about all the factors that really drive human flourishing. So on this walking tour, as we, as my team, we're getting to know this neighborhood, we see in the distance on 149th Street this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck. And all of these people, adults, are excited because this truck is there. They're applauding. They're like, it's here, it's here. And it's almost like the ice cream truck when kids come around. Or like, oh my God, it's ice cream, it's ice cream. So curious, what is that? So as we get closer to this truck, we see that there's graffiti lettering on the side of the truck. And the graffiti lettering says, "Who's your daddy?" Who's your daddy? What's that? Well, it turns out that the Who's Your Daddy truck is a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks are spending somewhere between $350 and $500 to answer questions like, are you my sister? Could you be my father? Basic questions about fundamental identity and who your family is. I was blown away. I was blown away. And what was most interesting was that, as I got to learn more, because I started doing research around Who's This Truck, I learned that the entrepreneur, this guy, Jared Rosenthal, saw a need in this district in the Bronx. The non-marital birth rate is 84%. He saw a market need and he created this truck. Demand was so high. He got a second truck, so he's starting a fleet of trucks. They started traveling to places like Baltimore and Chicago and DC, because all these communities wanted the services of the Who's Your Daddy truck. It was so popular that VH1, the cable television network, created a television show called Swab Stories, because they took a DNA swab to do these tests. So Google it. Google Swab Stories. You'll see it became entertainment. Will Joanne find out if this is her real father, or will Joe find out if he actually fathered this child? This was entertainment. But I realized this is a reality in the community in which I'm running schools. And so as I started to do more and more research, that's when I realized we can't not talk about issues like something as basic as family structure as being one of the fundamental elements of, if you want to have a conversation about human flourishing. Sure, there are factors like discrimination and other things that may exist in our society, but to the degree that what matters most to a child as they develop, number one is the structure and stability of the family in which they're being raised. And we need to have honest conversation. So I really started to grapple with what role should I and our schools play in really trying to understand this question and unpack what are the factors that really drive human flourishing. And that's when I when I started to really think about this concept of agency and a different kind of framework, which I put this format of free on. And so this is what I want to talk to you about, and I'm hoping to actually take some questions. Maybe we'll even start a little earlier, because in my mind, all of this makes sense. It's kind of logical, right? That family matters, not necessarily the family that you're from, but the family you form, the idea of a personal faith commitment, having access to educational choice, becoming an entrepreneurial problem solver in your own life, F-R-E-E, free. Seems to make sense. I have faced enormous opposition because For some people, by actually talking about agency and individual power and our common humanity and equality of opportunity, that threatens this idea of equity. No, 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 no. The real issue is these systemic barriers. So any idea that doesn't fully conform to the ideology of oppressive systemic discrimination, then that idea needs to be canceled. And so it's quite interesting. We are at an ideological impasse in our country, I think, and we need the courage. So if there's one word that you remember from this conversation, the name of my book is Agency, and that's a great word. But in some ways, the most important word is courage. Courage to stand up when you hear some of these ideas that you know have nothing to do with human flourishing, or are at best a much smaller factor than the things that we all know through experience and research: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. I'm putting a name to things in some ways are common sense. But increasingly in our society, we have to have the courage to say and stand for obvious things. We live in a weird time in which there is power that can be gained through victimhood. Power that can be gained through victimhood. And we just need to reject this ideology. I just visited a school in Cambridge, England a few weeks ago, the Michaela Community School. And among the things that they do to create an incredible culture of agency in their school is that they recite a number of poems. And one of the poems they recite is Invictus by William Ernest Henley. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. It was written during his own personal horrific challenges in his own life and pain that he was enduring. But the poem is about overcoming. And in this school, the Michaela Community School, the kids recite this poem. Imagine a room full, about 120 kids, all in one room in their uniforms, and the last two lines of the poem: I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Oh my gosh, it was electric in that room. And you just felt the energy of these young people saying, and by the way, these are young people in some of the poorest parts of London, in Wembley, and yet they're saying, I own my destiny. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. That's the spirit that we wanted to develop in our country. That's the spirit that typically leads to human flourishing. Doesn't mean it's a guarantee. We have to remind ourselves of the key institutions that make a difference in the lives of young people: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. That's what I'm putting forth to cultivate a new era of agency. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to you more about how we can do that. So, John, I don't know if we can turn up the mic for questions, but I'd love to see how folks respond and have some dialogue around these ideas.
That sounds great. Yeah, so thanks, Ian. I really appreciate it. Again, your great presentation and everything you're doing. And again, I think it's awesome just what you're doing in the school that you're CEO of. It's awesome. And I want to start with the first question. So my question is, to me, people being so wedded to an ideology that they're rejecting, information, they don't even want evidence. Have you, when you present some of the things that you're doing with your students and the success stories that they're having, I assume you talk to legislators in New York and they still have the cap on the charter schools and everything, but is there some movement that you feel like people are somewhat receptive to your ideas, and that maybe there might be a change of heart, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in one area we are seeing more and more success, and that's the first E in my free framework. And partly this is related to what I think many parents saw during the era of COVID, that, for several years we were all on lockdown. Many parents were dissatisfied with school closings and mask policy, but more importantly, because classroom instruction was now happening in your own living room, many families and many parents said, wait a minute, that's what you're teaching my kid? And of course, this was also a time where you had more sort of woke ideology. You had lesson plans that were bringing in ideas around race, whether it be, because of your skin color, you're either inherently oppressed or you're an inherently oppressor. There's been obviously a lot of more work in the transgender movement, that suddenly, 6-year-old kids were being exposed to ideas that were challenging the very idea of biological sex. And so more and more families, and I think as a result, more and more legislators have said just the idea of school choice is far more attractive. And so over the last 2 years, you've seen an avalanche of new school choice policies, and that has manifested itself in different ways. Florida and Arizona just passed new legislation around educational savings accounts, which essentially means that a parent now has a certain allotment of their public dollars that's tied to the student. And so I now, as a parent, can go outside of my zone school, and if I want to, and also, by the way, they can use this money typically at a religious institution. So that's a very big deal. Last year, the Supreme Court decided that a law in Maine that had typically banned public dollars to be used at religious schools can be. So we have a composition of the court that's now allowing parents to take a certain amount of tax dollars and use that at a religious school, a private school, a different public school. So giving that parent more and more freedom. So I'm seeing much more movement in that area. And even in New York, we all have our fingers crossed. But last week, Governor Hochul, the governor of the great state of New York, in her budget proposal for the 2023-24 school year, said she is proposing to eliminate the cap that exists on charter schools in New York City. The very next day after she made that announcement, 5 prominent Democratic leaders in New York government came out and held a press conference to fight that aspect of her proposal. So there's a lot of battle, but the very fact that it's been proposed means that we're making some progress.
Yeah, that's good news. And yeah, thank you. And I'm going to go to questions from the audience, but I do know also that you had trouble. I mean, there was fighting against the new charter school that you just formed as well.
Well, as I say, I mean, there's so many stories I can share, but yes, I mean, just so everyone knows, we just launched Vertex Partnership Academies, which is we believe going to become one of the premier international baccalaureate high schools in the country. In that you'll both be able to pursue an incredible college or university degree, or at the end of your sophomore year, you'll be able to choose a careers pathway. And by the way, this is another component for human flourishing. We need to create more pathways of opportunity in high school. So if a student at Vertex chooses the careers pathway, they'll be able to do apprenticeships in high school. So imagine the Mayo Clinic is going to be one of our partners. And so you could be 1 day a week or maybe every 3 or 4 afternoons a week, you could be working at a New York City-based hospital learning to become a phlebotomist. And at the end of 2 years, become credentialed as a phlebotomist and earn, a pretty good amount of money as your pathway to a career in healthcare. But we are pursuing relationships with Google, Cisco, real estate firms. So we're creating this incredible, what we think will be an incredible ecostructure. But here the no good deed goes unpunished. And so we were sued by the teachers union that was so threatened by the model that they tried to shut us down even before we opened. Thankfully, the first day of school was August 22nd of last year. On August 16th, a New York State Supreme Court judge threw out the lawsuit saying the union had no standing to close a school that had already been approved by New York State. But it does give you a sampling of the powers that are seeking to preserve and protect the status quo.
Yeah, yeah, those are super cool things you're doing. Okay, so.
Well, thank you for doing this. My impact on Bucky, I spent much of the 1990s and 2000s in Parliament, South Bronx, fighting for education. For the newspapers, I also wrote a book about Rice High School, three stops here. And I just want to say, my research, what was happening at that school, was happening at Catholic school, exactly what you're talking about. They preached this repeat responsibility. Didn't call it agency, called it a little differently. My question is two things. One is the moral aspect of what your schools do. You're in the public system, so how do you teach the religiosity and moral religious commitment and morality within the public system to try to build within the public system? And secondly, how did you come upon the baccalaureate curriculum, which I think is really, excuse me, that goes with what Tom Sawyer wrote about Dunbar High School prior to 1950. The most rigorous curriculum is probably in
Okay, I apologize. I know you couldn't hear it. It was a really long question, but anyway, I will tell you, as somebody who had worked with a different school, a religious school in the Bronx, Rice High School, as well. Anyway, so very complimentary of the work you're doing. But ask first part is that in a public school, how do you introduce religiosity? And then the second part is like, how did you settle on a baccalaureate model of excellence?
Sure.
I mean, it's way shorter than what he said, but anyway.
Well, hopefully someday, if any of you are ever in New York, you actually can come visit Vertex Partnership Academies, because ironically, we took over an old Catholic school that has been closed for more than a decade, the old Blessed Sacrament School, which is actually where Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor went to school. She went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 8th grade, and she was the valedictorian. So we are now, our Vertex Partnership Academies, our public charter school is actually on the premises of an old Catholic school. So we have to be very careful when we are talking about religiosity, because we are still we're a public school. Now, our organizing principle or our organizing pillars of our school are the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And as you'll see, if you're ever coming to visit our school, everything that we do in our school is some outgrowth of those 4 pillars, whether it be the literature that we read, the award ceremonies that we have every 2 weeks, where we have awards around students who've demonstrated excellence in any of these 4 areas. So our school operates against a very strong moral code. So to some degree, we go up to the line of indoctrinating in a particular religion, because there is that line that we feel we do have to acknowledge. But we believe our students will walk out of Vertex with a very strong sense of self and values, and the ability to be morally discerning. From a literature perspective, we will study aspects of the Bible as well as other important works. So our students will get an academic understanding of different religions as well. So that's an example of how we do it. The second part of the question was why the International Baccalaureate model? Well, we want to create the best school in the world, and so we also didn't want to recreate the wheel. And when you do research on some of the highest performing schools in the world, and not just in lower income urban communities, you tend to see the International Baccalaureate curriculum, the middle years program, the diploma program, more recently the careers model, which we've all adopted in our school. are seen as powerful, world-class curricula, really focuses on critical thinking, the development of cognitive engagement for how you solve problems. I mean, we had a group of prospective students come into our school a couple days ago. We presented to them a math problem, and we said to them, because it was a bit of a complex problem, we said to them, if this question were on a test and it were worth 3 points, if you got the correct answer, that would only be worth 1 point. 2 points would be us seeing the detail for how you thought about what was the strategy that you used to come up with that answer, because we value critical thinking far more than just getting to the right answer, and we want to see that cognitive engagement. So the International Baccalaureate model, we believe, is the premier curricula in the world. You know, the theory of knowledge, you've got to learn foreign languages, you've got to do these personal planning projects, and we just feel it's a powerful model, and incredible supports that come from the IB organization. And so for many IB graduates, and plus again, if you look at data, kids who come out of IB schools, far higher rates of not only college access, but college enrollment. And now we believe that we're offering the careers model as a pathway. We'll also see very successful our graduates entering professions coming straight out of high school, even as a sort of potentially temporary detour before going to college. And so we just think you won't find a school like this anywhere in the country, especially not in a low-income community. And so we think it's giving our kids what they deserve, which is the best school available.
Awesome.
So with like both parties polarizing because the other parties polarizing, how does one conduct middle ground conversation or compromise without ostracizing themselves on both sides?
Okay, yeah, good question. So with both parties very polarized, how does somebody engage in a discussion with both sides in a constructive way without causing more polarization, I guess, right? Or ostracizing one side or the other?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And we are at a moment where you know, someone will see, for example, I'll share ideas and they'll see, oh, wait a minute, you were a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You know, logical, oh, no, that's you're in the center right. I won't listen to anything you have to say. You know, or you'll hear someone say, well, I support Black Lives Matter. Oh, okay, that means you're like a left-wing lunatic and I'm not going to listen to anything you say. And so we are at this very strange moment, and I am often in the crosshairs. And you know, what I try to do is start with sort of first principles. Like, what is it that we probably both agree on? Do we both agree that kids should have an opportunity to have access to a high quality education? You know, because that literally is a conversation I've had with legislators who, for example, oppose the charter cap. And then I say, I'm sorry, who are in favor of keeping the cap on charters. And I say, you know, here's a district that it's not just for a couple of years, but for generations, less than 10% of kids coming out of this district are graduating from college. And these are your constituents. And here are some examples of charter schools that are working, that are doing good things for kids. And so I try very much, how do we have this conversation without demonizing people and demonizing each other, recognizing our common humanity, that I have respect for you as an individual, even if we disagree on our ideas. And that kind of democratic discourse is, you know, again, what we're trying to cultivate in our schools and what I'd like to do and cultivate as a society. You know, I'm going to be debating an author, Richard Reeves, in a few months. He's written a new book called Of Boys and Men, and Richard, who's a colleague, he's written some things in his book that I disagree with. You know, he has an ideology which basically says there's some real challenges facing boys, and there are in our society. But he goes the step further to say, basically, to rectify these issues, because marriage is basically dead, let's have boys prioritize fatherhood and not marriage. Well, in a district where 84% of babies are being born outside of marriage, I don't know if I want to send a message to young boys that fatherhood should be their priority. But rather than shout in the rain and demonize him, Richard and I are going to have a debate at University of Virginia on April 25th and really just try to have a constructive discussion around why he believes what he believes, and I'll share what I believe, and let's see where the data really lies. And then, frankly, let people come to their own conclusions. We have to have the courage of our own ideas when in situations like that, where you've got such an impasse. It's because people aren't willing to actually take the risk that, wait a minute, I could actually be wrong. Like, do we have the intellectual humility to accept that if you're entering that conversation, you're not operating in the same way that you're fearing the other person is, that you're so rigid in your idea that you're just going to reject it out of hand. So that's what I try to do. I try to really, establish that I do have a certain belief. Here's the data that's backing it up. But let's have a conversation about it with hopefully the betterment of kids, or betterment of our community, or betterment of our society as a shared goal. That's what I try to do.
Awesome. And yeah, and we're actually over time. But just to give you an idea of how well received this presentation has been, a classroom of students, when the class was supposed to end at 10:50, it's now 11:03, and most of them are still here. So that's a big compliment to you. That if I were here talking, they would have left a long time ago. So,
Okay.
and they can verify that. So thanks again for being here. We really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate it. I hope someday we can actually do this in person.
I hope we can bring you here in person sometime in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.